program change this morning. Our Anthony LeClaire is stuck in New York City thanks to lightning and 1,000 flights being canceled at LaGuardia and not able to join us. But we are grateful for a shuffle in our program to be able to introduce what was in your schedule, our lunch hour keynote, and the great folks from Ipsos. And so they're going to talk about today, and we have I think this is a very fascinating piece of research, and I think you're going to enjoy it. Because you're going to gain a thorough understanding of how to leverage distinct needs across 3 generations. And it's called Gaming with X, Y, and Z. So we have, on behalf of, to represent 3 different generations, our Gen X, Paul Lozon, Senior Vice President of Ipsos, and Gen Y, Paige Schofield, to present and talk about our generational challenges amongst our industry. So welcome, Paul and Paige. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoy. Go ahead.
Okay. Mic's on. Mic's on.
Great, mics are on. We're ready to go. Thank you very much, Paul. We're pleased to be here. Got a call at 11 o'clock last night. Can you show up for 9 o'clock instead of 1:30? Oh my. Anyways, we made it happen. We're here. And
Good morning.
yes, I am going to be representing the Gen X generation. I know I really look like Gen Y. I know that. But I'm truly very old Gen Xer, borderline boomer. But I identify more closely with Gen X. So for now, you can probably call me Mr. X for the next 45 minutes. My colleague Paige here, she's Gen Y, for real.
For real.
And she works with a lot of Gen Z if you're from the US. So she can identify with both of those cohorts. So she's going to represent them, and you can call her Miss Wise. Get it? Wise. Nobody got it. Too early, I guess. These are the age categories, how we broke up this sample. And we are replicating this study in the US. So we're using the same age bucket so we can compare between the 2 countries, even though the categories are a little bit slightly different on age. And we stretched the Z category a little bit older, 1 or 2 years older, just because we needed to be able to reach those people and get enough samples so we could report on them. So is this another millennial presentation? Because I'm sure you've seen 1 or 2 in the past 10 years. Not really. Because we're talking about Gen X as well. Gen X, we understand, is still the bread and butter of the gaming industry, so we don't want to forget about them, and they provide some very interesting context. What we know about millennials, though, is that they're more than just one type of person. We have done studies all over North America with millennials. We have dissected them, we've segmented them attitudinally, and in many jurisdictions, we found that that quintessential millennial that you see advertised about and marketed to and communicated to, they're not necessarily all like that. In one jurisdiction, in fact, we found 4 millennial segments under 35. Only one of them, 25%, was the quintessential millennial. The others were very different in their attitudes. So we're going to provide you some context. We're going to only dissect them by age, the younger millennials, older millennials, and compare them to the Xers. We're going to start off by giving you a broad overview of their views on life, what they do for entertainment, technology, things like that, and then we're going to funnel, as we go through our presentation, we're going to funnel down to gaming and finish off with that. So let's start. So one of the things we know about Gen Xers, almost 3 in 10 say that technology makes their life more convenient. That's pretty good. They're connected, right? They get it.
But not as much as us. Over 50% of Generation Y believe that technology makes their life more convenient. And I have a little personal story that I can share with you today. So in my household, we're having a very serious debate. My boyfriend is Generation X. I am Generation Y. And our debate is over whether or not to get Alexa. And so while I want to wake up every morning and ask Alexa the weather, he doesn't want Alexa listening to our conversations. So unfortunately for me, I think he's going to win because while I want convenience, he's more concerned about security. And Generation Z is right there with us.
When it comes to communicating with our friends and the primary means of doing so, Gen Xers are definitely more traditional. We tend to use email, and that smartphone, we actually use the phone part to call people and actually talk to them. Now, I mean, really, who would rely on social media for 100% of the way they communicate with their friends? Like, who would do that?
Well, 2.5 times, we're 2.5 times more likely to use social media as the primary way to communicate with our friends. 2.5 times more than Generation X. And when we look at Generation Z, that we see even more exponential growth, up to 4 times that of Generation X. And so when we look at this and that trend, you know, we can't help but wonder, what is the next generation going to look like? Potentially 8 times, 80%? So building on this idea on social media, we wanted to explore the affinity towards each of these social media platforms among each of the 3 generations. And so when we look at Generation X, we see that there's the strongest affinity to these more traditional social media platforms like Facebook and YouTube. You know, they're using Facebook to communicate with friends, to keep in touch with family, and they're using YouTube to watch DIY home improvement videos and whatnot. So definitely a stronger affinity there, and it's been around longer. Less of an affinity or a closeness towards these other social media platforms. When we layer on Gen Y, we see a very similar trend, although Generation Y is a little bit closer. They feel a bit more of that connection to each of the social media platforms. Again, not that surprising, given we grew up a little bit more with social media at our fingertips. But when we start to see a real difference is when we look at Generation Z. And with Generation Z, generally, again, there's more affinity towards each of these social media platforms. But when you look at Instagram and Snapchat, you just see them, you know, way out ahead of the pack in terms of having that closeness. And when you look at Facebook, you know, surprisingly, they're actually at the same level as me in Generation Y. And so our hypothesis around this is, you know, perhaps, you know, Facebook is potentially losing that momentum with this generation. Maybe it's not going to be as cool or see that, you know, growth in that coolness factor. But then again, you know, who also wants to be on the same social media platform as their parents?
So I guess, Paige, what you're saying is that when it comes to Facebook, the Gen Xers kids, they've clued in that they're Gen X, or the Gen Z kids have clued in that their Gen Xer parents are creeping them on Facebook, and that's why they're dropping out? Okay, we got to find another way to do that. And I know as Gen Xers, I don't get, you know, InstaFace and Snapbook. Like, I just don't go there. I don't get it.
So to wrap up this section just around some attitudinal differences between the 3 generations, we explored a number of different areas with this group. And we're only going to share a very small proportion of those. And what we learned is that Generation Y and Z are much more spontaneous in their behaviors. And that is demonstrated by this slide that you're looking at now, in that around 3 in 10 of each generation are going shopping just for fun.
Right, shopping for fun.
Oops. Sorry.
When it comes to
Too
Gen
controlled.
Xers, I don't really think so. I mean, how many of you are Gen Xers here with teenage kids, for example? Shopping for fun would be nice, but you don't often have that luxury. You're basically shopping for necessities. You got to feed those things. They eat a lot. They cost a lot. Sports, music lessons, etc. You don't have time to go shopping for fun, even though you might want to do it. So it just doesn't make sense for Gen Xers.
And building on that, Generation Z, around 3 in 10, believe that, you know, the focus should be just on enjoying life. Let's not worry about the future. And Generation Y, we're in the same realm as that, just a little bit more concerned about the future. Is this a function of age and just, you know, where they are in their life path? We're unsure, or if it's actually just a generational thing.
And Gen Xers, much more concerned about the future. We just bought a new house, got a bigger mortgage, got college tuition funds to look after, got car payments to look after, got to feed those older teenagers. Like, we can't slow down to enjoy life right now. We're so busy thinking about making sure that we're okay in the future. We're going to switch gears a little bit, take a little peek at how they spend on entertainment and how they view entertainment. So one thing we know for sure, statistically, Gen Xers' income are bigger than Gen Y's income, and Gen Y's incomes, on average, are bigger than Gen Z income. That makes sense. But as a proportion of their income, Gen Xers spend over 8 out of every $10 on necessity, what they classify as necessities, and only 17% on entertainment. A little different story when we're talking about Gen Y and Gen Z.
Yeah, Gen Y, we're in that sweet spot. We're spending about a quarter of every dollar on entertainment, and we're not really concerned around that amount of spend. We're a bit more frivolous from that perspective. And most of us have full-time jobs and therefore salaries, so we're making a bit of money. But then in addition to that, only 1 in 2 of us have kids. And for those who do have kids, they're on average a little bit younger, so a little bit less expensive. So we're in a very comfortable position and don't still have the financial burdens that Generation X does. And Generation Z, they've got it pretty good too right now. Most of them are students or living at home with their parents. So again, they don't have some of those financial limitations. And that allows them to spend a little bit more. So a third of every dollar they're spending it on entertainment. And so they're a little bit more relaxed about that as well, at least for now.
So it makes you wonder, for them living at home, what necessities really mean. When we look at the choices they make, Gen Xers tend to stay a little closer to home. Again, they have all these other restrictions. They're looking after necessities. They got all these pressures. So their entertainment is closer to home, family time, watching TV, PVR movies, things like that. And they're also the age cohort that obviously skews higher on participation in lottery, draw games, and scratch games. A little different for the other generations.
Yeah, again, Gen Y, we're living it up. The social activity or the entertainment activities that we participate in, they tend to be a little bit more social in nature, cost a little bit more money in nature. We're dining out, we're going to the pub, or restaurants. We're investing in our wellness, so we're paying for extracurriculars. We're also investing in our wellness, so going to the spa and getting facials. And on the gambling side of things, we're actually the most likely generation to be participating in online gambling and sports betting. And Gen Z, again, they've got it pretty good too. Most of Generation Z are living at home or students, as I mentioned before. They're at that point in their life where they're finding their independence. But they don't have that much money yet. They don't have their financial independence, and therefore they choose to participate in activities that are free or affordable. So they're watching Netflix, they're mobile gaming or video game gaming, and so what they do is a little bit more affordable in nature.
While it's a very foggy memory, I do remember that easy lifestyle somewhat. We're going to change gears again. We're going to touch a little bit on loyalty programs and payment methods. And I think there's probably some things here you'll go, yeah, I sort of knew that, but I think there'll be something that'll be a little different. When it comes to the average number of loyalty programs that each of the cohorts belongs to, Gen Y dominates. They have an average of 8 loyalty programs. And for them, it's really about trying to spread out that distribution, get as much as they can out of loyalty programs. So it makes you wonder, is it really loyalty if they're spreading out across so many programs? They're just trying to get points, obviously. We all are. When it comes to the actual categories that each of these cohorts are really committed to or invested in, Gen X dominates in groceries and travel and airline. And when you're thinking groceries, well, didn't I say they've got those late teenagers to feed? They eat a lot. They cost a fortune. So they want to get the best bang for their buck on what they spend at grocery. How many of you here travel regularly for business? Semi-regularly. How many of you are hostage to, loyal members or reward members to an airline? Probably most of you. I think you understand that. So if you are in that category and you tend to travel a bit more, of course you're going to be invested in hotel membership program and airline, more so than any other age cohort. Our Gen Y, similar pattern, but not so much so. Gen Z, not at all. When it comes to fashion, apparel, and beauty, I mean, really? I don't really care about that. That's pretty obvious. However, much more important with that generation than it is with just this generation overall. Totally makes sense.
Yeah, so building on that, and when we think about loyalty and what consumers want from their loyalty, cash is king. They're looking for those cashback rewards, and I don't think that anyone here is really surprised by that. But what was interesting is that this is especially true for Generation Z. Perhaps they don't have any money, so they're looking for that cashback reward. But what's interesting is that they're also more likely to be open to experiential prizes. So trips or other types of promotions that are based around an experience, perhaps at your casino, they would be more likely to be open to that. So while cash is first, with this particular cohort, they are also more open to these alternatives.
When it comes to payment methods, credit card is still king for the two big segments here, Y and Z. And of course, I talked about the reward programs. They're big on trying to get points, right? Whoever has the most points when they die wins. That's the way I look at it. I have two of those big expensive credit cards, one for business, one for personal use. And I tell you, I max everything I can on these cards. I put everything I can. So that $120, $150 fee every year is totally worth it for me. Makes sense. Gen Y is sort of getting that too. They're very similar on cash as a payment method, but where they start to differentiate with Gen Y is the other payment methods. Mobile pay, virtual currency, things like that. So we're starting to see a shift here.
Yeah, and that shift really starts to continue when we look at the younger generation, Gen Z. That shift away from credit specifically. And so they're shifting towards more cash or debit. And this could be for a number of different reasons, but one, they might not need credit yet. They're just young enough, they haven't found the need. Or two, they don't want it. So they might prefer to spend the cash that they have on hand as opposed to the cash that they don't have. But also this generation grew up with parents that were part of the credit boom, and perhaps their parents mismanaged their credits in some way, and they're learning from those mistakes and don't want to follow in their footsteps. But the real important number to show on this slide is that 15% in other forms of payment. So that includes mobile pay or virtual currency. So this 15%, I don't think it's going anywhere except up. And I think that's especially important for everyone in the room here that's here around, building around the gambling industry that is based off of the exchange of winning and losing currency, and the implications of this other forms of payment. I think we should all be considering and exploring at this point in time.
We're going to take a quick look at some traditional things like bricks and mortar shopping. And when it comes to shopping at convenience stores and pharmacy, and by the way, that's where a big chunk of the lottery network is, right? Gen Xers, almost 9 in 10, still do this on a regular basis. It's a big thing for them.
Yeah, and there's a pretty sizable proportion of Gen Y that are shopping at convenience stores, but it's a 10 percentage point decline. And so it might not seem like a big number, but when you think about that from a proportion perspective, and then you add traffic and frequency on top of that, it's a huge disruption to the amount of traffic that's going to convenience stores. So I definitely would be concerned about that, especially if your lottery that relies on convenience stores as a distribution point. And Generation Z, it's the same thing, although even a little bit softer.
Shopping online, we're the stuff. Almost 75% of us shop online. And as a matter of fact, this morning I got another email notification, Amazon delivered something else for me. I'm a voracious Amazon shopper.
But we're even more likely to shop online. We grew up with the internet, and most of us grew up with the internet, but also we're very familiar with the option of purchasing products online. And I don't think this is going anywhere except up. Gen Z is in the same bucket, and if you think about what has happened in the online industry, even just in the last couple of years with Amazon Prime and being able to order something and then have it on your doorstep within 24 hours, or order your groceries from the comfort of your couch or your office and have them delivered to your door. So again, I think this is, it's obviously been a big growing trend, and I think it's going to continue to go in that direction.
Online grocery shopping. How many people here have done that? Online grocery shopping? Really? Wow, I kind of like to look at what I'm buying. That's a big risk for me.
So building on this idea of where people shop, we wanted to also understand, where do people gamble? And so the data that's represented on this slide here is just among gamblers, including lottery players. And so what you can see is Generation X, it's almost universal among that generation for them to gamble at a retail location like a convenience store at some point in the past year, and this is driven by lottery. As generations get younger, that participation declines a little bit, down to 78% among Generation Z. When we look at casinos and that hospitality network, definitely softer gambling participation overall. Again, this is among gamblers. But we see that trend flip a little bit with the generations, where Generation Y and Z are more likely to gamble at a hospitality channel than the other cohort, Generation X. And just on that as well, we do believe that these two younger cohorts are motivated by the social aspect that the hospitality network can provide that the other two channels aren't or can't right now. And then with online, as we would all expect, there is lower participation overall. Generation Y is leading the pack in this area. And again, I would suspect that even if we were to come back next year and do the same study, we would see these online numbers increase.
So we did some very interesting but fairly basic analysis on trying to get a perspective on what people thought had momentum going into the near future on these different activities. So to get at this, we asked two questions, very basic. Do you participate in whatever gaming or gambling activity? And the second question was, do you feel this activity is gaining or losing popularity in the near future? And then what we did is we looked at the gap between these two metrics and we labeled that momentum. Very interesting findings that come out of this. When it comes to Gen Xers, things that they don't participate much in, online wagering, PC gaming, they tended to perceive that as things that are happening out there, that seems to have a lot of momentum. And sort of a second lower tier to that to them was paid mobile games and sports betting. Again, they don't do it a lot relative to the other cohorts, but they tend to see this as having momentum in the marketplace.
Generation Y, we're actually not that different than Generation X when it comes to where we recognize the growth. But what stood out was the potential growth in wagering in line. That's just a little bit stronger. So this generation, we're already the most likely to participate in this activity, and we're showing the greatest opportunity for growth. And in that second tier is the same activities that Paul mentioned around mobile gaming, sports betting, and video gaming. Generation Z, same four activities that are showing the same likelihood for growth. So those are four important gaming activities. But the potential growth for Generation Z is just a little bit smaller than the other two generations. So in the top tier for growth is wagering online and video gaming or PC gaming, and in that second tier is sports betting and mobile gaming.
It's interesting when Gen Z, as they earn more money over the years, you can see that the landscape for gambling is going to change. They're going to change it. So it's pretty important. When we look at gambling participation, Canadians, I think everyone knows here, we like to gamble. Gen X, Gen Y, virtually 8 out of 10 of those age cohorts have gambled in some sort of activity in the past year. It's in our DNA to gamble. When it comes to Gen Z, kind of falls off quite a bit. Now we're all hoping that that's a maturation thing, that they'll catch up eventually, but there's some implications there related to product offering. We'll get on those near the end of our presentation, but it's really something to think about. For Gen X, what is the most favorite activity? Well, draw games. And I can attest to that. I'm a core draw game player, very core draw game player. Like, I actually have tickets in my pocket. I can't wait to check them. I'm serious. My OLG tickets right here. I'm a core draw game player, and so are most Gen Xers. And this is not a prop. These are real tickets. They're winning. And we got $5 worth of winners here. It's similar for the others, but not quite as much.
Yeah, so Generation Y, we definitely like our draw games too, but as Paul mentioned, not to the same degree. We're about 50%, or we're just over 50% in terms of participation. Where we see draw game participation drop off is when we look at Generation Z. That's around 3 in 10 participated in a draw game in the past year. So we have to ask ourselves, is this a value proposition problem, or is this the fact that they're just really young and haven't really dipped their toes in the water yet? When we look at instant tickets and we look at Generation Y and Z, we see, or sorry, Y and X and Y, it's getting confusing now, X and Y, we can see that participation in instants drops off a little bit, but their participation is very similar to one another in this category. When we look at Generation Z, we see that there's actually an increased level of participation compared to draw games. And that gap between Z and the other two generations is actually shrinking a little bit. So that leads us to believe that there might be something more that is appealing to this younger generation, Gen Z, as it relates to instants than draw games. So is it about the instant gratification? Is it about the fact that the odds are better on instants than a draw game ticket? Is it about the fact that they actually have this ticket in their hand and they can scratch it? These are all some potential motivations that we believe are potentially shrinking that gap a little bit. When we look at casino gaming, all of the generations are a little bit more clustered together. Lower participation overall, less than 30%, but they're grouped together, and that gap has even gotten a little bit smaller. So again, we're sort of wondering, we often hear about this doom and gloom picture that is painted for casinos among this younger generation, and I would look at this data and say perhaps maybe it's not actually the case, and that there's something that is appealing with this younger generation that we haven't quite tapped into, but there's definitely some appeal there.
And I think the trick is frequency for that younger generation, right? Obviously, we know they don't go to casinos as frequently as Gen Xers, who are the bread and butter, and that's really the target for that, is to build up that frequency over time.
Yeah. We also explored other gambling activities, some secondary or more traditional or less traditional forms of gambling, so wagering online, sports betting, etc., and lower participation overall. And all three generations are very clustered close together in terms of their participation. So they're all kind of seeing the same in terms of the value proposition there. Where the only difference is when you look at Generation Y for wagering online, it's a little bit more ahead of the pack, as I had mentioned earlier.
All right, we're going to go into more specifics on casino gambling, just a few slides on that. And when it comes to Gen X and Gen Y, very similar participation, much softer among Gen Z. And when they're at the casino, less frequently, we've already acknowledged that, but when they go to the casino, they definitely behave differently. Isn't that right, Paige?
Yeah, so we wanted to look at your casino visitors and say, once they step foot in a casino, what are they doing there? Are they gambling? Are they participating in amenities? Or are they doing some sort of combination of both? And so that is represented by the pie charts on that slide right now. And so what you can see is generally the shapes of the pie look pretty similar. The gamblers and those who participate in both, pretty similar. But where you start to see the real difference is when you look at those amenitors. And the amenitors are those who stepped foot in a casino and didn't do any gambling. They only participated in amenities. And so only 13% of Gen X are amenitors. So that is obviously your gambling segment. But for Generation Y, we see that proportion of amenitors slightly increase. And then for Generation Z, it increases to 1 in 4. So 1 in 4 of this younger generation is walking into a casino and not doing any gambling, but they are participating in amenities. So this ratio between the three is going to be very important when you think about what does your future design of your casino look like with each of your 3 generations. And it could, again, this is a Canadian perspective. It could look very different depending on what region you're in and who your market is.
Amenitor, doesn't that sound like something from the new Jurassic Park movie? When it comes to motivations, motivations to go to a casino are fairly distinct across all 3 cohorts, and they tend to reflect their types of motivations for other things in life, not just gambling. So when we're looking at Gen X, it's all about winning, baby. That's it. The thrill, winning a bit of money, dreaming about winning big. And why would that be? Well, this generation grew up in Canada through the evolution of lottery games. Lotto 649, Super 7, Lotto Max. When they became game age of being able to go to casinos, they went to casinos, and that was way before the amenities boom. You went to a casino to gamble, not to dance, not to do other things, right? That's why you went to a casino. So it makes sense. This is what motivates these people. It's about winning money.
Well, Gen Y, we love to dance. So we find that going to casino, we're motivated by the amenities. We really value that social aspect. We want the food, we want the drinks, we want the dance floor or the show. That's definitely something that we value more. But we also do value the gaming element as well. So we want to sit down and play and gamble. And so we're a little bit more balanced, I'd say. Generation Z, we're a little bit of a mix between the other 2 generations. So Generation Z are similar to Y in that they value that social aspect. This definitely is going to be critical with this generation moving forward. But they also like this idea of potentially winning. So that financial aspect has come back again. The idea of winning $20 would mean a whole heck of a lot with this generation.
For those who don't go to casinos, what's stopping them, right? Well, there are some fairly core barriers to this. Risk of losing money. And we have studied non-casino patrons for years, and qualitatively, quantitatively. And the risk of losing money, when you peel those layers back and you really dig down to what does that mean, it's not that they're afraid of losing $20, $50, or $100 at the casino. They're afraid of walking in and losing that $20, $50, or $100 in 5 minutes and getting their clocks totally clean. It's about, any casino person here, time on device, right? It's about time and entertainment for them. They want to spend money, but they want to be entertained for a while. They want to get something in return. So 5 minutes of dropping money and it's gone. It's not fun for them. So that's why they come back and they tell us, I'd rather spend my money on other forms of entertainment because I see more value in that. So that's a barrier for them. And some of you are thinking, welcome to the casino, right? Welcome to gambling. Well, but there are things we can do to make that barrier go away or at least mitigate it. Some of the things we looked at, $50 worth of free chips, a free night in a hotel, promotions oriented around free tickets to a show, things like that. Very appealing to those Gen Xers who don't go to the casino. This is something they say, yeah, you know what, I would consider this.
And Generation Y, we're pretty similar. So for anyone in the room that is responsible for coming up with promotions or perhaps increasing the number of each of these generations or the proportion of each of these generations that come to the door of your casino, we have good news for you is that we're actually motivated by similar incentives. Although for Generation Y and Z, we're a little bit more motivated by that financial aspect. So those free chips, free money, sounds pretty good. And that's because the financial piece is a little bit more of a bigger barrier for us.
Some sort of next tier down, not quite as popular or as incentive oriented, but a free meal. Who wouldn't want a free meal? Well, no, our meal wasn't free today. We all paid for it. But a free meal of some sort, fine dining at the buffet, $50 voucher to spend on non-gambling amenities. Pretty attractive to Gen Xers.
And pretty attractive to us too, in fact, slightly more attractive and similar with Gen Z. And this isn't entirely surprising because as I showed you just a couple slides ago, there's a greater proportion of this generation that's going to a casino just to participate in amenities. So it's not surprising that they would be more likely to be motivated by an amenity-based promotion. So as Paul mentioned, there's two main barriers that are stopping people from going to a casino around the risk of losing money and the preference to spend their money on other forms of entertainment. But there were four key secondary barriers we wanted to outline for you that were very specific to Generation Z. And the reason why we wanted to outline these is because we do believe that these barriers can be addressed through a tweaking of communications, but then also taking a hard look at what amenities, what mix of amenities and games that you have on the floor and figuring out what the right balance is.
All right. Although online gambling is a growing industry, it's small, we certainly can't ignore it because that's really part of the future of the industry. It's not the future, but it's definitely a part of the future. When it comes to Gen Y, almost 2 in 5 say they've gambled money online in the past year, and that doubles up on Gen Z, almost double on Gen X. So they're definitely fairly active in this category, and they're probably going to continue to lead the charge in the future.
So just like we wanted to understand offline activities, we also wanted to understand what was going on online for gambling activities. And the parallels between the two are there. Generation X, more likely to participate online in lottery and instant games than the other generations. For Generation Y, we're a little bit more across the board. Again, we're a little bit more balanced. We like the traditional casino games, but we also like the sports betting activities, including esports. Generation Z is a little bit more focused on that esports side of things. They tend to go towards table games a little bit as well, but esports is definitely the driver for now.
So beyond the top two kind of universal barriers that I don't like to gamble or I can't afford it, we looked at some secondary barriers to online gambling. And the first one that came, or the next one was, it's confusing. So of the Gen Xers that don't do it, almost 40% said it's confusing. That's interesting. So everything we've told you so far about Gen Y and Gen Z, technology, et cetera, do you think they're going to be more or less confused than Gen X when it comes to online? Put up your hand if you think they're going to be more confused. All right, who thinks they're going to be less confused? Come on. Well, Paige, what do you think?
So based on everything that we've gone through today, I would have thought that they would be less confused. And I guess I was more focused on the channel than what they were actually doing. But in fact, Generation Y and Z are much more confused when it comes to gambling online. And so if we ask ourselves why that is, we think that perhaps it's the fact that Generation X, they've been around longer, they're heavier gamblers than we are, so they're actually just more familiar with gambling in general and the activities that they can participate in and the how-to and whatnot. Whereas with Generation Y and Z, we're a little, that's actually a little bit more of a barrier for us. And so it's not necessarily about the channel, but it's actually more about the activities that are being offered on the channel.
And that's a big lesson for us too. We had the same assumption. We thought, well, it's technology based. These digital natives are, of course, they're not going to be confused by this. But the barrier is actually understanding gambling.
Yeah. There's also an issue of awareness. So it was pretty, this wasn't entirely surprising to us because we've done a little bit of research in this area, but the awareness of the regulated option within each of the jurisdictions was really low. So this is definitely going to be a key focus for some of our local jurisdictions to focus on establishing that awareness in their market. Because obviously if they want people to play, they have to know that they actually exist. And then additionally, the second part of this is to show them how and where to get started. So there's just this idea of, I just don't know, like, where do I go? I'm not really sure. How do I sign up? What's needed, etc. So there's a little bit of an education piece that's going to be needed there to get some of this generation to cross that hurdle and move their gambling online.
Okay, well, lottery is big in Canada, so we're going to wrap up our presentation by looking at lottery, a little bit on lottery. Some very interesting stats here. I mentioned already, big Gen X, big player of lottery games, so is Gen Y. Drops off a cliff when it comes to Gen Z, and that is definitely concerning and something to think about for the future.
And similar to what we did for casino visitors, we wanted to look at lottery players and understand, if you play lottery, what are you playing? Are you playing a draw game? Are you playing instant games? Are you playing some combination of both? And so when we look at those who play both, you can see that Generation X leads the pack with over half participating in both draw and instant games in the past year. Generation Y, we're actually pretty similar, drops off a little bit, but where you see a little bit of a decline is when we look at Generation Z, with only 43% participating in both. When you look at those who participate in draw game only, the participation levels are pretty flat between the three generations, with a little bit higher for Gen X, a little bit lower for Generation Z. But where we start to see the real difference is when we look at those who play instants only. And so very small proportion of Generation X are playing instants only. So again, that draw game is definitely offering a good value proposition to Gen X. The amount of instants only increases a little bit for Generation Y, but it really goes up when we're looking at Generation Z. So 33% are only playing instants. So again, building off what I said earlier around the value proposition of instant gratification, better odds, a bit more tangible, there's definitely something that's resonating here that'll have implications for the lottery.
Remember earlier when I talked about that momentum analysis we did for gambling? We did the same analysis when it came to draw games and scratch games. And from a Gen X and Gen Y perspective, the perception is, even though they're big players of lottery games, the perception is that as a category, draw games is sort of declining in popularity or momentum. And the size of the arrow is kind of relative to what they feel. Surprisingly, among our Gen Z, they tend to see a little bit of momentum. Part of that is, again, think of this age cohort. They've just become of age where they can gamble and legally buy lottery tickets. So they know it's out there, they've seen their parents do it, so they tend to think, well, this got a little bit of momentum. But the Gen Xers and Gen Y, like I'm a Gen Xer, and I've admitted to you, I'm a very core draw game player. And I would agree, if I take my researcher hat off, I take my industry hat off, I would agree this category probably is losing momentum. But I'm not going to stop playing. I'm going to keep playing. But I just perceive that it doesn't have that momentum. It's no different when it comes to scratch. Very similar pattern we see in both across all the cohorts. All right, we're going to call it a day or a morning. It was supposed to be day this morning. And leave you with about 4 takeaways, I think. And coming back down to the theme of this conference, how does technology hold the key? Well, I think when you look at the differences across all three of these age cohorts, technology is very much part of the future for getting some of those new gamblers and getting them to stick to the industry. Want to go back to this thing about the millennials. Are they just one person, one type of person? They're not. We've only dissected them by age for you. When you actually start to get more surgical and dissect them by attitude, the differences become even more obvious, even within sort of under 30s. They're very different. So don't think of that category as one type of person you can market to.
So I'd first like to ask everyone in the room, is there something that you think that you could be doing better today to better understand the implications of age in your business? And if there is, write it down. And then I'd also like to ask you to challenge your partners, challenge your vendors, your marketers, your product developers, to help you better understand the implications of age. and so that you can make appropriate decisions and target the right cohort with the right message and the right product.
Talked about technology a lot. The differences from X all the way to Z are absolutely staggering. And they'll continue to be staggering. Like Paige said earlier, can you imagine what it's going to look like with social media and things like that 4 or 5 years from now? It's going to be so different.
So this second key takeaway, it's probably not new news to you. You've probably been hearing about this for a couple of years now, but I'm just going to reinforce it in that your product portfolios do need to include games that have that social aspect, that are intriguing, they're fun, they're interactive, and with an emphasis on inviting. If you want some of these younger generations to play and come to your casinos, you have to make the games inviting, or to create an inviting experience. But that's not saying that you can forget the status quo.
Absolutely.
Or they can't forget the status quo. So let's be frank, the majority of your revenues are coming from your core players who are playing traditional games, and they like them and they don't want them changed. And so you need to continue to support that. Yes, this is an aging demographic or aging consumer, but people are living longer and they're not going to be going anywhere anytime soon.
And when it comes to the fun and inclusive type of stuff, Paige and I had a few minutes before things got going this morning to check out one of the new table games on the floor. So I encourage you all to check the trade show floor for sure. But there's one particular game there, and I'm not going to name any drops of who it was, but it starts with Lucky, ends with a 7. That was really interesting. Mm-hmm. I thought that was a very simple game. It's fun. It makes people get together as a group. There's a whole table thing that's involved in terms of everyone playing together, all pulling in the same direction. And that's the kind of thinking I think will really appeal to this particular cohort Paige is talking about. Online gambling. It's growing slowly. I mean, when online gambling or online lottery started more than a decade ago in Canada, it was kind of launched in the middle of the night with no marketing, no messaging, no communication. It was kind of like, we'll build it and we'll hope they come. Well, they didn't come that fast initially, and now we're starting to actually market these products because we're not so scared of backlash anymore. It's happening. Sports betting, Paul mentioned that during his opening remarks. The decision in the US recently might spur things to change in Canada. So this could become bigger, faster. And the thing is that all this regulated stuff, you know what's also real? The gray market. It's a real competition. It's powerful. It takes a lot of money away. So even if you're getting into that space, or if you're partnering with an online provider in your casino and you're trying to set up a relationship where your casino goers can play online when they're away from your casino and vice versa, you are facing some stiff competition, and you need to work hard to address that for sure.
Yeah, and I think our opinion on this is that the casino floor is always going to be in flux. So what is working for you today won't necessarily work for you in the future. Understanding what the right balance is between the games and amenities, but then also what the right mix is within your amenities and within your games. If you're thinking about how to use space, the decision on whether to build a club or whether to offer a buffet is a very important one when you think about what each of these demographics would be, or which of these cohorts would be more likely to go and participate in those.
There are barriers to entry. If you're not currently a casino player, a lottery player, or an online gambler, there are some barriers. But I think we've identified, and there are barriers you can never touch. Somebody who says they're morally opposed, well, you're not going to convert them, you shouldn't waste your time. But the other people, some of the barriers we've talked about, they're easily addressable. There's a lot of things you can do, right, Paige?
Yeah, so our recommendation to you is think about how you can use technology and leverage it in your communications to create that inviting atmosphere and pull in these cohorts. So promote these fun and intriguing and inviting offers. Like some ideas around this are offering social media campaigns, perhaps not on Facebook, but on other platforms, thinking about how to, can you create some sort of scavenger hunt on your property, or have some sort of a digital assistant while a player is playing a table game to help them understand how to play, or perhaps some of the nuances around the games. These are all the types of things that you should be considering in terms of attracting these younger players. But that being said, any of these kind of targeted niche campaigns do not replace your traditional communications. They just further support it.
It's all aimed at removing the intimidation factor, right? I remember my first time walking into a casino and I didn't know anything about gambling. It's like, whoa, this is pretty scary. It's pretty intimidating if you don't know it. So we're going to call it a wrap now. This is all we have for you. If you have any questions about this, this was a very big detailed study. It's a syndicated study, which means it's available for anyone. Come by our booth, chat with us. We'd be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.